All right, let's talk about the other fluid system in the body, the lymphatic system. So, like I said before, the capillaries are leaky and fluid is constantly leaking out of the capillaries. And this fluid is called lymph that leaks out, and it's oozing around in your body all the time. Immune cells use this fluid to crawl around in. And it has to return back somehow, or it would just fill up all of your body tissues. So it gets back into the circulation through the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is a system of veins that allows this lymph to get from the extremities back into circulation. And it dumps into the veins in the neck. And if you get too much lymph in your tissues, this is a situation called edema, and you know, there are some situations where it happens and it's not abnormal, like during the late stages of pregnancy. Women can get edema in their lower legs and in their ankles caused by this lymph not being returned well enough. It can also happen after surgery if the lymph vessels are disrupted by some kind of a surgical procedure. There are also nodes along these lymph vessels, and these nodes are part of the immune system. The nodes are where some cells in the immune system, memory cells, memory B cells, and T cells live there, and that's where they monitor what you're exposed to. And they can leave, they can come and go from the lymph nodes. And if you have some kind of an infection, often the nearby lymph nodes will be swollen because there is cell replication going on there, and the cells that are there are also secreting compounds which cause this swelling and pain. And we'll talk again more about that when we get to the immune system chapter. So lymph vessels, the lymph in the lymph vessels is not being pumped around. There's no lymph heart that's pumping them around, and it's open. It's open to the interstitial fluid. Instead, the way that fluid gets pumped back to the body is just by contracting the muscles nearby. So when you move your arms and legs and move those muscles, that's squeezing the lymph vessels and squeezing that lymph back up into your core. So it's a little bit different than the rest of the circulatory system. It's low pressure, and it's just being moved around by your body movements. So gravity can help lymph move around. So if you have swollen hands or feet, you know, you can elevate them and gravity will help move it too. But it's just the nearby blood vessels, when they contract, squeeze the lymphatic vessels and squeeze that lymphatic fluid back towards your core. Blood has several different components. There's a fluid portion of the blood called plasma, and then there's a cellular portion of the blood as well, and some cell fragments as well. Platelets are really cell fragments, they're not whole cells. My dogs are having a thing over here. Hey, stop it. I'm making a video. So the liquid portion of the blood, the plasma, which is about 55% by volume for normal blood, it contains a lot of water, but it's much thicker than water, and that's because it contains protein, mostly albumin, but there's also antibodies in there and clotting proteins like fibrinogens, and also our apolipoproteins, which are part of HDL and LDL, which help transport lipids around in the body. There are also salts in there, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, and also bicarbonate that's formed from carbon dioxide. And we also have some nutrients that are dissolved in the blood, like glucose, which we already talked about a little bit, fatty acids, vitamins, waste products, nitrogenous waste that are on their way to the kidney, and hormones are also dissolved in the plasma. The cellular components, you've probably heard of the three main cell types. white blood cells, red blood cells, and then platelets. And platelets don't have nuclei, they're just cell fragments. And the white blood cells, leuco means white, so leukocytes just literally means white blood cells. And there are many different types that have different functions, and we'll talk about some of these when we get to the immune system. And then erythro means red, so erythrocytes are the red blood cells. These do not have a nucleus in mammals. And these are in charge of carrying oxygen and a little CO2 in the venous blood. But we'll talk more about the white blood cells and the different kinds of white blood cells and what they do and where they're from in the immune system chapter. This is a little video of a single blood vessel in a zebrafish, and scientists like organisms like zebrafish because they are transparent in the early embryonic stages, and so we can make videos like this. But what you're going to see is a very rapid circulation with the red blood cells just zooming by, and then these larger white blood cells that are just kind of rolling along because they can stick to the walls of the blood vessel, and so they're not zooming along with the rest of the blood.
Watch leukocytes roll along the inner surface of blood vessels in a small vein of a zebrafish, a transparent organism often used in cell biology research. These leukocytes use a surface of glycoprotein known as L-selectin to attach to the vessel wall in the vicinity of an inflammation. Notice how slowly the leukocytes are moving relative to the erythrocytes that are passing by too rapidly to be seen clearly. Credit: Felipe Herbamel, Institut Pasteur, France.
Dogs, stop that. And the white blood cells in our bodies are doing the same thing. They can also squeeze in and out of the blood vessels by squeezing between the cells that make up the blood vessels. They're looking for injuries to the blood vessels. They're looking for signals that there's inflammation near where they are. And if they detect any of these inflammatory signals, then they squeeze their way out. And again, we'll talk more about that. So these cells that are in the blood are manufactured in the bone marrow. And there's quite a few different places in the body that have active bone marrow that's manufacturing these cells. They increase their production of erythrocytes in response to a particular hormone, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is now being synthesized by recombinant bacteria. It's used in cancer therapy because cancer patients often have low red blood cell production, and so erythropoietin can help increase the amount of red blood cells that they make. It's also a drug of abuse for endurance athletes, so this is one of the drugs that Lance Armstrong admitted to obtaining and using when he was competing in the Tour de France. It's undetectable. The only way that it can be detected that they're using it is if individuals have a sudden and unusual increase in the number of red blood cells in their body. So stem cells in the bone marrow, which can divide many, many times, they can produce several different lines of cells that are then now restricted in their fate. So the lymphoid progenitor cells are more restricted in their fate, although they are stem cells in and of themselves. They can produce B cells and the T cells in the immune system, and then the myeloid progenitor cells can produce erythrocytes, platelets, as well as some of the other immune active cells. And we'll talk more about those in another chapter. So birds really have weird lungs. And it would be really interesting to know when this evolved during their evolutionary history. Did theropod dinosaurs have this circular breathing that birds have? It's very efficient. It's more efficient than our breathing. It allows for a much higher turnover and diffusion of oxygen into the blood. And since flight is such an energetically expensive activity, this partially explains how birds can have enough energy for this extremely difficult and high energy activity that flight is. It does make them vulnerable to particular toxins in the air, though, more vulnerable than we are, because it will infiltrate any toxin in the air will get into their entire lung, whereas the kind of lung ventilation that we have, we always have a little bit of kind of dead space at the bottom of our lungs if we're not breathing really hard, where newly inhaled air mixes with old air. So it's less efficient, but birds' very, very efficient breathing and lung system also means that they're more vulnerable to toxins in the air. So what happens with birds, so they have this weird kind of circulating air, so that air only flows one way through the lungs. So they inhale and air goes into these sacs that can push the air out. It goes into the lungs where oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange takes place, and then out. So it takes actually several breaths to get the air all the way through. And because it's only flowing one way, there's no mixing of deoxygenated air with freshly inhaled air. So it's kind of the same level of efficiency that you see between a 3-chambered heart and a 4-chambered heart. So with a 3-chambered heart, you have mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. That's an inefficiency. With our breathing, the way we breathe, there's mixing of deoxygenated air in the bottom of our lungs with freshly inhaled air, and they mix together. With birds, there's no mixing. So oxygenated air comes in, deoxygenated air goes out, and it's just a continuous circular flow of air. Air only goes one way, so it's much more efficient. There's no mixing. The way we breathe, it's called negative pressure breathing. We increase the size of the lung space, and that pulls in air by negative pressure. And we use our diaphragm, but we also use muscles of the rib cage in order to breathe. And if you ever were in choir or band, you probably at some point had to focus on your diaphragm breathing to get more air into your lungs for either singing or playing your instrument. So this will all sound very familiar to you. So we can force our diaphragm down to pull in air, and you can do this. You can, dogs, that will do. By forcing out your stomach, you can pull your diaphragm down, and you can also breathe by expanding your rib cage with the rib muscle. So we have 2 ways to expand that. And these are both under voluntary control. The diaphragm is partially under involuntary control as well, which is why you continue to breathe even when you're not thinking about it, although we can put it under voluntary control if we want. So, but it is totally controlled by involuntary mechanisms. So how do we know how deep to breathe? That signal comes from our brain, from the brainstem. And one of the mechanisms by which we determine breathing is by detecting the pH of our blood, because carbon dioxide, when it dissolves in water, is a weak acid. And so the slight acidification of the blood triggers a desire to breathe. They're not fighting, they're playing. Stop! Stop that! Go somewhere else. Oh, what? Shoot! Shoot! So our blood pH is very tightly controlled. It's right around 7.4. Now, if you hold your breath or you exercise a lot, you're going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in your body because you're not exhaling it anymore. Or if you're exercising really heavily, you're going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide that's being produced by respiration in your tissues. So now your blood is going to slightly acidify. The pH is going to go down very slightly, not by much. And that is going to be detected by pH sensors in your arteries, and that's going to send a signal to the medulla to deepen your breathing. And it makes you feel like, this is where the urge comes from. When you hold your breath, eventually you get this irresistible urge to breathe. This is why. And it happens even if you're asleep. You don't have to be conscious to have your breathing be affected by this pH change. And this is also what makes you feel out of breath. If you have high blood CO2, you're going to feel out of breath. You're going to feel like you can't catch your breath, and this is why. So the oxygen and CO2 are always going to diffuse in and out from the air to the blood, back to the air, by going down their concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. There is no active transport here. There is no energy being expended to transport oxygen or carbon dioxide across membranes. They are just diffusing by simple diffusion, which means they're going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So when you first inhale air, the concentration of oxygen is going to be higher in the air than it is in the blood coming into your lungs, the deoxygenated blood. So that means oxygen is going to diffuse into your blood. The concentration of CO2 is going to be higher in the blood than in the air. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out into your lungs. And then you can exhale air that has a higher level of CO2. Once that oxygenated blood gets to the systemic capillaries, the reverse is going to happen. Now there's a higher concentration of oxygen in your blood than in those tissues, so oxygen is going to diffuse out. And the reverse is going to happen with CO2. They're building up CO2 because those cells are respiring using the mitochondria. So CO2 is being produced as a byproduct. That's going to diffuse into the blood. So it's always simple diffusion, and it always depends on where there is a higher concentration versus lower. So if there's higher oxygen on one side of the membrane, it's going to diffuse across that membrane down its concentration gradient. That's all it's doing. That's what the whole system is based on. The whole purpose of the circulatory system is to bring that diffusion closer to the cells that are the target. Here's another little video about gas exchange. Again, I'm not going to show it to you right now. It's in the PowerPoint, so you can watch it. It's just a little summary of that, what I just told you. So what we call respiratory pigments, these are proteins that carry oxygen. And in our cells, this protein is hemoglobin is confined to being inside of the red blood cells, but that's not true in every organism. In other organisms, it's just dissolved in their blood or their hemolymph. And it can be different colors depending on which metal ion is present. So our blood is red because of the iron that is present in hemoglobin, and that's what we use to carry oxygen. But other animals have different colors of blood. Arthropods and some mollusks have hemocyanin, which gives their blood kind of a bluish color because of copper that's found in there. And this really varies. So spiders, cephalopods, crabs have blue blood because of the copper that's used as to help carry the oxygen. Insects have yellow blood. Worms and leeches have green blood, so these are both annelids, if you notice that they're both in the same phylum. And all vertebrates have red blood. And this is, again, this is due to whichever metal ions are present in the proteins that are helping the blood or the hemolymph to carry oxygen. Carbon dioxide doesn't have a special carrier molecule. Carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma. Some of it, however, does stick to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So when the hemoglobin loses its oxygen, the oxygen diffuses away, diffuses into the tissues. And the carbon dioxide concentration is high, some of that carbon dioxide is going to be bound to the hemoglobin as well. So all of the carbon dioxide is not dissolved in the plasma, changing the pH. Some of it is in fact going to be inside the red blood cells because of its attraction to the hemoglobin. So we talked about open versus closed circulatory systems, single circulation like what we have in fish versus double circulation. And with double circulation, we can have a 3 or a 4-chambered heart. Arteries always flow away from the heart. Veins always flow towards the heart, regardless of whether it's oxygenated blood or not. We talked about blood pressure and systolic versus diastolic portions of the cardiac cycle and how blood pressure is measured. We talked about lymphatic system that helps return fluid to the circulation. And the lymphatic system is an open system. It doesn't have a pump. The pump for the lymphatic system are all of your skeletal muscles and gravity. We talked about the difference in breathing between birds and mammals. So birds have a peculiar kind of circular way of moving air through their lungs, a one way, which is more efficient. There's no mixing of deoxygenated versus freshly breathed oxygenated air in birds like there is in mammals. And we talked a little bit about the different colors of respiratory pigments that are found in blood and hemolymph, and the different colors are the result of mostly from the metal ions that are present in that, associated with those proteins that are helping to carry the oxygen. Okay, that's the end of circulation and gas exchange.